Hello and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg, as usual, proudly powered by Research Luxembourg and recording at the Media Center of the University of Luxembourg. And in today's show, we have two guests, Anne-Catherine Guio and Olivier De Schutter. Anne-Catherine is an economist working at LISER with a background in statistics, comparative EU data analysis, and policy-oriented research. Her main research focuses on material deprivation, poverty, social exclusion, and well-being. Whereas Olivier De Schutter is a legal scholar specializing in economic and social rights and international law professor at the Université de Louvain. He served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food and is now United Nations Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. Olivier, together with Anne-Catherine, Eric Marlier and Hugh Fraser, authored a book called Escape from Poverty, which will be the main focus of our discussion today. It is also worth mentioning that Olivier will give a keynote speech at a conference organized by Chambre des Députés, Challenges of the Youth in Luxembourg, which will take place on the 23rd and 24th of May. As usual, we'll share the link to a more detailed description of the conference in the show notes. Olivier and Anne-Catherine, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Our pleasure. Many thanks.
I have to say, I read the whole book and I had so many notes that it took me more time to write down the notes in another notebook than actually read the book, I think, because it was just so full of interesting data. It's really impressive work, so kudos to you. And I really think everyone should read it. I read a lot of scientific articles, I have to say, and sometimes I just read them, I'm like, what's the key takeaway? Whereas here is just so data-driven, which is amazing. And now, of course, moving on to what it is about. I only gave the main title, which is Escape from Poverty, but there's also a subtitle. What is the subtitle?
Subtitle is Breaking the Vicious Cycles Perpetuating Disadvantage. The book is about the reasons why when you are born in a low-income household, it is very difficult to overcome that disadvantage. Child poverty is really a life sentence for a crime that the child has not committed. And the book is about all these mechanisms that push people into poverty and make it difficult for them to escape it.
So here we're talking about the so-called intergenerational poverty, right? Or IGPP, as it is called in the book. So what is it? It's exactly that kind of idea that there is this vicious circle that you can't escape from generation to generation?
Yeah, exactly. So children living in poverty during childhood face a number of problems beside the lack of income. So they may lack access to healthcare, housing, environment, games, leisure, but also other kind of support from the states. And then they have more chance to become adult living in poverty, having in turn children living in poverty and reproducing all the time this mechanism. So we try to identify all the mechanisms explaining this vicious cycle.
You try to identify, so you base yourself also on research of other people and gather it all together and kind of find the key elements.
Yeah, exactly. And on our own research, because we work a lot also with data in the EU and also worldwide. So both of us and the two other co-authors, we could also analyze our own data showing this perpetuation of poverty across generation and all the mechanisms. So really the fact that children living in poverty have less chance during childhood to have access to all the things that I mentioned. So in terms of healthcare, but also childcare, and that's true in almost all countries.
Yes, but then of course I have to go for a bit of a populist comment, right? So we often hear that, well, I mean, it's all about merit, it's all about ability. Why are we talking intergenerational? It's just people should start putting more in and then they will get more out. Olivier, what do you think about that when you hear it?
Well, this is a very popular discourse, and the paradox highlighted by a philosopher such as Michael Sandel from Harvard University is that the more society builds itself as a meritocratic society, the more it is difficult for people to understand that one is rich or one is poor, not because of one's personal achievements, talent, and effort, but rather because of the circumstances in which one has been raised and chances, the opportunities one has been given in a biography. And in fact, it is one of the messages of the book is that merit should be deconstructed. The reason why people study at university, the reason why they have all the cultural codes that allow them to succeed in society, the reason why they are able to overcome crisis by calling upon their networks of friends and family to support them is because they were just lucky enough to be raised in a better off family. And we note that merit is very misleading if it serves to focus the attention on the individual's responsibility when in fact societal factors, structural factors, the circumstances of one's birth are actually decisive in providing life opportunities.
And it's very interesting because it leads me to one of the examples that you're giving, that there have been studies, these experiments where it was just about moving people from one neighborhood to another neighborhood. So a bit of a kind of fate-based, let's say, choosing certain families, moving them somewhere else. And then you did see better results, right?
Indeed. We have examples of low-income families having been able to live in a much better off neighborhood. And that made a huge difference in the children's lives. With one proviso, however, which is that in low-income contexts, the solidarity of neighbors, the extended family may play an important role in supporting people. So whilst moving people from one place to another may have positive impacts, particularly by expanding the networks the child may benefit from and allowing the child to have a much more supportive neighborhood, this should not be at the expense of maintaining the very precious social links that people have. One of the impacts of poverty is loneliness, the lack of social links, solitude, and that may be a result, unfortunately, of moving from one neighborhood to another. So one has to be cautious, but you are right, that the neighborhood in which one is raised has a huge impact on the child's development and ability to aspire to a different future.
Okay, we're talking in Luxembourg, right? And I have a feeling that the moment you discuss very superficially poverty in Luxembourg, the first thing you will hear is, Luxembourg, rich country, absolutely, there's no reason to discuss it. And Catherine, what do you say to that?
And actually in Luxembourg, there are 1 child out of 4 living below the poverty line, which is defined at the EU level as 60% of the median income. So that's the first thing. 1 child out of 4, which is really a huge poverty rate for children, one of the highest in the EU. And on the other hand, when you explain that to people, they said, okay, yeah, but you do not take into account the fact that the threshold is defined at the national level, which is true, and which is exactly what we want. We want to compare the Luxembourgish level of living to the other people in the country, not to Romanian people or Estonian people. The second thing that you will hear when you explain that the poverty rate of children is very high is that they will perhaps explain to you that there are a lot of provision of in-kind support, like free childcare, free transport, free book. And that's true. And when you take that into account, that's true that the level of child poverty decrease a bit, but only a bit. And it remains a huge challenge. And when you take into account different indicators, so for example, the child-specific deprivation, really looking at the living condition of children, do they have access to games, to leisure, but also to food and to shoes and to clothes and such items, then you discover that there are 8% of children living in deprivation in Luxembourg. And for example, in Croatia, Estonia, Lithuania, the deprivation rate is much lower. So if you base the challenge and you compare the challenge to the wealth of the country and the level of GDP per capita, for example, you really see that Luxembourg is under the target that it could reach based on this wealth.
And it also means that, we have to probably talk about different indicators. You said child deprivation, and I know that you contributed to the definition of that indicator, which very well shows that it's, not only about how rich the country is and how much money we have access to, but all the other things you mentioned, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the deprivation results from the resources of the household, so the money, the wage and the social transfers and so on, but also on the costs. And in Luxembourg, the one of the main problem is housing cost, as you know. And when you look at the regression, looking at the impact of the different determinants of child deprivation, you really see that in Luxembourg, one of the most important variable explaining the deprivation level is housing cost. So the share of housing cost in the income, which is really huge, especially for renters, especially on the private market, and especially for the lone parents. Not only, but lone parents really suffer from an additional problem of being alone and having to afford everything as the couple, including the housing costs, which is really, really huge.
So we talked Luxembourg, and you also mentioned the loneliness and some other conditions that are important. So I think it's a good moment to look at the pub quiz questions that you prepared for us today. So one will be more the Luxembourg side, and the other one more focusing on the intergenerational poverty. So Anne-Catherine, can you ask your question first?
My question is about the proportion of children not living with both parents. So how many are there in Luxembourg?
And Olivier, your question, what is it about?
My question is about the intergenerational perpetuation of poverty and the link between the level of poverty and social mobility. And the question is, how many generations are needed for poverty to have no impact anymore on the ability to have equal chances of having a median income? In other terms, how many generations are needed to erase the consequences of being raised in the 10% poorest decile of the population? And we can take two examples, France and Brazil. So the question is, how many generations are needed for a person raised in a low-income household to achieve equal chances of having a median income in France and in Brazil?
Perfect. So two different sides of the same coin, we could say, although here we have Luxembourg and here France and Brazil, but also important discussion. Thank you so much. And listeners, remember the answer only at the end of the podcast, so you need to listen to the whole thing. Olivier, you mentioned social mobility. So I have to say this is one of those words that I kind of see in reports and I kind of understand it, but I still want to hear from a specialist. What actually is social mobility?
Social mobility refers to the possibility to move from one level of income to another. For example, to move from the 10% poorest to the 30% and to join the middle class. And what is really interesting is that most people assume that some levels of inequality are desirable because that would motivate people to make efforts to seek better qualifications, and thus it would increase social mobility to have some levels of inequality. But what we show in the book is that it is the opposite, that in fact high levels of inequality discourage people from making efforts to overcome disadvantage, and high levels of inequality lead to less social mobility. In other terms, if you want to live the American dream, well, you better live in Denmark. Because in America, in the US, where levels of inequality are quite high, it is very difficult to overcome disadvantage and to move from the lowest decile of the population to the median income, for example. Whereas it's much easier in countries which have much less inequality, such as Denmark.
Do we have data for Luxembourg for that as well, how it works or not?
Yeah, not exactly the similar data, because the study that Olivier mentioned does not include Luxembourg, but in Luxembourg we have recent data about the circumstances of your family when you were 14. So we ask all the adults in the sample if the economic situation of the family was good, not good, excellent, or terrible. So you can see the poverty rate of these adults today in function of the economic situation when they were teenager. And there you see that there is a huge difference depending on the socioeconomic situation when you were a teenager.
Huge difference meaning that it changed, or huge difference in the sense that it kind of perpetuates itself.
Yeah, it's a kind of perpetuation, meaning that the adults who live in a difficult situation where they were teenagers are now have a higher probability to be poor adults now in Luxembourg. So there is a difference depending on the situation where they were teenagers.
So that is very important, and it kind of reminds me of the European Child Guarantee here that is also, of course, important for Luxembourg. So first of all, can you tell us what it is about and where we stand as a country?
The commitment of member states was to guarantee to all children living in poverty or social exclusion, called people in need, children in need. And so they should be guaranteed to have free access to healthcare, childcare, free school meals and schools. So education, no school costs for them. And also adequate housing and nutrition. So in that case, effective access to housing and nutrition, not of course free access, but adequate and support from the government to get this access. So that's the commitment of member states. It was signed in 2021. So I think it's really a good step forward. And now we are in the monitoring phase of, so member states have proposed plans to reach these targets. And we are monitoring progress or lack of progress in the different EU countries. About the Luxembourgish situation, so I will say that on paper, Luxembourg performs quite well because there are free childcare, at least for 20 hours per week, so the chèque service accueil. There is also a number of policy guaranteeing that education costs are not too high for the household with children. So there are free meals in primary education and free meals in secondary education, but only for children living in poor family. The problem is that it's not easy to find adequate data to check that the lowest income have really an effective access to these policies. So we don't know actually if poor children can really access free childcare. And the qualitative information that we may find, for example, from NGOs and so on, is that it's difficult for them to have the possibility to go to the childcare if both parents do not work, for example, or if at least one parent do not work full time, or if there is no possibilities in the surrounding of free childcare position. And that's for childcare, but that's also true for school meals, for example. So we don't know. We don't have enough data. These data are available in the different ministries, but they are not yet used to assess and to evaluate the policies in place, which is really the big challenge that Luxembourg faces. Because on paper, it's quite good, but we must check that it's not only for the average child in Luxembourg, but also for the poorest ones.
Let me make perhaps on this 3 comments. The first one is, Anne-Catherine Guio is too modest to mention this, but together with Eric Marlier and Hugh Fraser, my co-authors, they are the ones who advised the European Commission in its proposals that led the member states in June 2021 to adopt the European Child Guarantee. So their work was absolutely instrumental in making this happen. And although this is just a recommendation, it actually can be immensely effective, even more so than a legally binding instrument, because each member state has now to appoint a child guarantee coordinator at national level to monitor the implementation of the action plans that the member states have to adopt in order to move towards free healthcare, childcare, education, school meals, and adequate housing and nutrition accessible to all. So it's I think, an important development. And my third comment is that Anne-Catherine is alluding to the fact that when rights are guaranteed on paper, this does not necessarily mean that each and every child has access to that, because there is a high rate of non-take-up of rights, particularly by families in poverty. And for the UN, I dedicated a whole report to this issue of non-take-up of rights. One of the findings was that low-income households who have poor access to information, poor access to internet services, who are not equipped to fill in online forms and provide the documentation as required to benefit from certain programs, may be left out from certain schemes that are, in theory, accessible to them. So there's a gap between legal coverage and effective coverage. And this gap is one that we have to be very attentive to. The only way to do this is to ensure the adequate participation of people in poverty in the design of the schemes so that the very concrete obstacles that they face are not overlooked by the legislator. And in fact, in June 2023, there was a major meeting in Luxembourg of the International Social Security Association that spent a whole 2 days discussing this issue of non-take-up of rights, which therefore is now gladly increasing the visibility amongst policymakers.
Yeah, perhaps I should add something on the situation of non-take-up in Luxembourg, because we have just published a study actually on non-take-up. It's a qualitative study. So from the quantitative point of view, we have some figures indicating that the huge non-take-up, for example, for allocation loyer, so housing allowance, the take-up is 20%. So the non-take-up is 80%. For the allocation Vicious, the non-take-up is 60%. So that gives you an idea of the problem. And when we try to investigate the reason why people do not claim these allowances, actually they do claim in many cases. So they know them, and sometimes they claim them, but they are refused because they don't fulfill, the eligibility criteria in the law. And when you look at the law in details in Luxembourg, what we see is there are many reasons for tertiary non-take-up in Luxembourg. Tertiary non-take-up is usually the fact that in the law itself, people are excluded. So they are excluded by law due to the eligibility condition. And one example, which is really illustrative of this problem, is the allocation from lone mothers or lone fathers when the other parent disappeared and doesn't help with the cost of the child. And in that case, it's called PALIM in Luxembourg. And in that case, you can ask for the help of the states to have such an allowance. And to be eligible, you have to be poor. You have to go to the court and having explored all the possibility via the court. And you have to prove that the father or the mother who disappeared is alive and somewhere in the world. So you have to find him or her. So it's extremely difficult for poor people to fulfill all these conditions. That's really a good example why too few people ask for PALIN, and those who want to have it are refused. So there are a number of problems. Information, as Olivier explained, is one of the problems, but perhaps it's not the main problem in Luxembourg. The main problem is really the threshold, which are quite low in terms of income. And some people think they are eligible. For example, people paid at the minimum wage. They think that they are eligible for allocation Vicious. But in many cases, if they don't have children, for example, they are not. They are just above the threshold used to define eligibility. That's the other problem. And also the last one, which is important here because we are at the university, and which was amazing for me, is that the students are excluded by law. So when you are a student, you have no possibility to have, for example, Revis. You have no possibility to go to the food store. So you cannot ask access to food store, the social food store. So it's really amazing that even in case of extreme deprivation, there are no safety net for students. You can only have access to education allowance, which is not enough to live properly in decent life in Luxembourg. So you have to work. But if you work, you lose the study allowances, which is really a terrible situation for many students here at the university or in the high schools.
Wow, that's a lot of data, a very important one. And I also had no idea about it. So it's great you're mentioning that. And again, this is a situation where we just look to other countries. I'm sure, Olivier, when you go around the world and you go to countries that we would assume have so many different issues. Actually, we have a lot to deal with in Luxembourg, I can see. A lot to do. And also, I would add, this is not only Luxembourg, but in general, there is the problem about the suspicion towards social services, right? I don't know how much it works in Luxembourg, but Olivier, could you comment on that?
Indeed, one of the major reasons for non-take-up is the fear that low-income households have to seek support and to contact social services. In some cases, this is because they fear that the child will be removed from the household if indeed the child is considered at risk. And that is a very pregnant reality in the UK, in Scandinavian countries, and also in countries such as Belgium or Luxembourg. So they may fear to explain that they have difficulties because of the risk that the child will be removed. And more generally, when you've had a traumatizing contact with social services, when you've been scolded by them for not going to an appointment or not following a particular training, for example, you may not want to contact social services. And even though you may have rights, you may not dare exercise those rights. That is what low-income households explain when asked to speak about poverty. They speak not only about lack of income and lack of decent work, they also speak about humiliation, discrimination, the fact that their contribution to society is not recognized because not formalized in a diploma. And these are all hidden dimensions of poverty that ATD Fourth World in particular now insists should be much better taken into account.
I'm always very much surprised that when policies are designed, they very often don't include the people who they actually are aimed at. I mean, that would be such a natural thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. And there are good experience of such inclusion. You know, in Belgium, which is not perfect, but in Belgium, in some ministry, they have experts du vécu, so people who are experts in poverty, and they are there to help them to, for example, prepare the reply to the people when there are exchange of information between the administration and the poor people. So the letters should be easy to read, easy to understand, and they are there for this reason, but also for many other challenges that people can face when they have to go to the administration asking something or providing some information. That's really important. But even at the policy level point of view, it's really important to ask people the advices and the way that they live the situation. And it was really instructive in the study, what I mentioned. Even if I work on poverty for 20 years, I was so shocked by the living condition of people in Luxembourg and people like you and me, just having a separation, having big health problems, losing the job, and then falling into poverty. That was really shocked. And one of the things that they have very often explained, that's the stigmatization that suffer from. Even if it's not the fault, they feel guilty of being poor. They feel guilty to ask for help from the states. And it's very common in Luxembourg that this idea that the poor may, for example, fraud the social security system and profit from the system, and they are not brave enough to go to work and so on. So there is this kind of reflection and the things that people can repeat and repeat to explain that the poor are poor because of themselves, but not by the situation.
And Hannah, what you said about participation of people in poverty is, I think, absolutely key. If you don't involve them in co-constructing the solutions, the very concrete obstacles they face will be misunderstood and neglected in the shaping of policies. One interesting experience is the one led currently in France, where they set up the Conseil national des politiques de lutte contre la pauvreté et l'exclusion sociale, the National Council on the fight against poverty and social exclusion, in which people in poverty are represented, and they also have regional councils of the same nature to make sure that the knowledge of people in poverty is used and not just the knowledge of academic experts or even practitioners of poverty. And I think it's really important.
Yes, of course. But when we talk poverty, we should also actually mention that there is a correlation, there is a link between poverty and life expectancy, isn't there, Olivier?
Indeed. And the figures are really astounding. In the US, for example, we have a very recent study showing that people of the 10% poorest segment of the population have a life expectancy that is 10 years lower than people having a median income. And in the EU, those who have a university degree, on average, live more than 8 years more than people without a university degree. In England, we have a study showing that the gap between the richest and the poorest groups of the population was 9.3 years for men and 7.3 years for women. That is largely due to the fact that when you are poor, you live in environments that are more polluted, you live in overcrowded dwellings, you have fewer social networks, you have poor access to health, particularly preventative healthcare. And so all these factors combined result in these huge gaps between the life expectancy of the rich and the life expectancy of the poor.
Yeah, if I can add something,
of
because
course.
We have from a few years we have data on what happens on children. So as Olivier mentioned, it's known that the life expectancy differs between income level, but now we have data on exactly what happens during childhood, and already in childhood, in the first years of life, you can see the difference in health status, in the occurrence of chronic problems and so on. So among children from poorest living conditions, so it's already there that we have to act and to find solution to fight against the gap.
As we are slowly wrapping up, before we solve the pub quiz questions, I just want to put now in 5 minutes everything that was in the book that we did not manage to discuss, which is a very ambitious goal, but let's try to do that. Olivier, could you tell us what is the classic approach of fighting poverty, and what would you suggest? What are your key suggestions to the policymakers, how to fight it actually? What should be done with the vicious circle?
So Hannah, the classic way in which we've been combating poverty in the past is very simple. You grow the economy, you increase monetary wealth, and then by tax and transfers, you redistribute the wealth created to people in poverty to compensate for the fact that the market creates inequalities. That has been at the heart of the building of the welfare states, particularly after the Second World War, during the 30 years during which we had very strong rates of economic growth. That worked. And the question was, how are we going to redistribute the benefits of growth? I think we are now reaching the limits of this system for two reasons. First of all, because economic growth cannot be pursued infinitely, because we are crossing a number of planetary boundaries. Our environmental footprint is really very strong. Loss of biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions responsible for climate change, overuse of resources, and so on. So we must be much more attentive to ways of combating poverty without relying on economic growth. And the second limit is political. If you have an economy that is creating inequalities, and then you take from the rich to redistribute to the poor, there will be a point where people will resist taxation, will not want this Robin Hood approach to combating poverty. And that will make it very difficult for governments to continue to fight poverty if they meet this resistance. Indeed, very few political parties during the election time will claim they want to raise taxes in order to help the poor more. So that is why we need to move to a sort of second generation type of solutions to combating poverty, which should make the economy much more inclusive, ensure that the way the market operates ensures fair chances, fair opportunities to all, ensuring that the experience gained by people in poverty, even though they don't have the diplomas that formalize this, will be recognized, having strong anti-discrimination provisions to protect people in poverty from facing discrimination. In other terms, we must not only redistribute wealth, we must also ensure that the economy is inclusive and does not create inequalities in the first place. And that is, I think, also in the interest of sustainable welfare states, right? To avoid support to low-income households having to depend on an ever-increasing size of the economy, which is simply environmentally not sustainable.
Anything to add, Anne?
Yeah, that was perfectly explained. And I think in Luxembourg, we are exactly at this turning point. So far, we have invested a lot in the growth and in some sectors have expanded a lot, but it really created polarization of the society. And now we face the danger of this polarization in terms of poverty, but also in terms of social cohesion.
So it's important that you at LISER and other scientists continue the dialogue with the policymakers. I know it's not easy, but it's really, really crucial. And hopefully the next decisions that will be taken will be fully evidence-based. I'm always advocating for that here in the podcast, but it's a long process, and fingers crossed for that. If you're interested in the subject, of course, do remember about the conference as well, and go to a lot of different interesting seminars that LISER organizes as well on the topic of inequality. You can really hear a lot, and listen to other episodes where I discussed inequality and other research done at LISER. But time to solve the pub quiz questions. And we will start with Anne-Catherine.
Yeah, the reply is 20% of children do not live with both parents here in Luxembourg.
And that's a big number.
It's a big number.
Me.
So usually we have in mind that around 3-5% of households are in this situation. But when you take into account the fact that we speak about children and you took children as the unit of observation, it's 20% of children living without both parents, meaning that in many cases they live in lone parents households and mainly with the mother, facing a lot of challenges, as we explained in Luxembourg, in terms of housing, in terms of work involvement and all the things that these brave mothers have to face too.
And possibly non-take-up of rights as well.
Exactly. And not so many policies supporting lone parents. There are just crédit d'impôt, which is quite low. And as you may know, in terms of fiscal rules, the taxation of lone parents is terribly unfair in Luxembourg. They are more taxed than couples having the same income. So there are different taxation rates for lone parents, which is quite incredible in view of the number of challenges that they face.
Okay, so a lot to do there as well, for sure. And Olivier, what was your question and then the answer?
Well, the question was, how many generations are needed for low-income households to achieve equal chances of having a median income in two exemplary countries, France and Brazil? And the answer is that in France, it takes 6 generations to overcome that disadvantage. In Brazil, it takes 9. And that is extremely telling. The best countries are Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, where you need 2 to 3 generations to overcome this disadvantage. In countries such as Colombia, South Africa, Brazil, it's 9 to 11 generations. And that shows how being raised in a low-income household makes it much more difficult to overcome this advantage in adult life, generation after generation.
Just to wrap up, we're advocating for all the policymakers to read your book, get informed, start changing the policies and listen to other discussions that you can get about this, because it's a very interesting topic and a lot to be done. Thank you so much, Anne-Catherine and Olivier, for coming today and sharing a little bit of what you're doing, because yes, we didn't even discuss your role as the UN Special Rapporteur or other things you're doing at LISER. Next time, as I said. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Anna.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us, to check what we are writing on all the social media. And of course, we are always open to guest suggestions or just questions or anything else that comes to your mind when it comes to research done in Luxembourg. Thank you very much. This was SciLux, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.